Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video in which I will go through 5 very important pawn structures that can arise in your games. And to become better at positional chess, you have to understand the advantages and disadvantages of certain pawn structures and how to play around them. So we'll go through the basics of the pawn structures and explain to you how to play with or against it. And please leave a like and subscribe for more amazing content. Let's dive right into the first pawn structure. The first position we are going to look at is the isolated queen's pawn position, also known as the IQP, and it's a pawn structure characterized by an isolated pawn on the d-file. The pawns on the c and e file have disappeared, making the player unable to defend it with a pawn. And what makes these positions special is that both the players with the IQP and the player playing against it have their own advantages. And usually the player with the IQP has short-term advantages in the form of outpost squares on e5 and c5 for a knight to jump into. And besides this, the player with the IQP usually gets to make use of open diagonals to attack the enemy king early. And this could put the enemy king under pressure at the beginning of a middle game. And an advantage that you need to capitalize on early is usually called a dynamic advantage. And it's time dependent and you have to be fast to take advantage of it. The player that plays against the IQP gets a static advantage, which means that there is a long-term positional weakness. And if black manages to block the IQP from moving forward with his knights and can start attacking it, it would possibly lead to positional concessions for white, because he, for example, has to defend with the rook, making it inactive. In an endgame, the person with the more solid pawn structure usually has an advantage, and therefore if you play with an IQP, you should avoid trading pieces for as long as possible. Trading off all the pieces would usually lead to a disadvantage in the endgame. This also means that if you are playing against an isolated queen's pawn, you should never complain if the enemy decides to trade off pieces. The more pieces that leave the board, the less pressure they can be put on your king, and the closer you get to an endgame. If you manage to land in a pawn endgame, the isolated pawn on the d-file will become very weak for white, because nothing can defend it anymore. The goal for white should be to trade it off in time by pushing it and creating positional weakness for black instead. One thing to note is that to play with or against an isolated queen's pawn, you need a lot of experience. So don't try to avoid IQP positions because you are afraid of losing them. The more games you play and analyze, the better you will get at playing them. So now let's dive right into the second pawn structure. The second structure I'll be discussing today is the doubled pawn, and for anyone who doesn't immediately know what I'm talking about, doubled pawns are when two pawns of the same color are in the same file. This could happen when a pawn takes another piece or pawn, because it moves diagonally, it can reach another file on the chessboard and then land in the same file as another pawn. A big misconception for beginners is that doubled pawns are always bad. In many cases, having doubled pawns can have its disadvantages, but what many people don't know is that it can also have its perks. I will give you 2 examples in which it will become very clear what those advantages and disadvantages are. The first position we are going to take a look at is one in the Ruy Lopez, and this opening initiates after the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5. A very common move here is to play the move a6, and beginners often think that taking on c6 is advantageous for them, because they double the pawns on the c-file. The reason why it has potential to be very good is visible when we start taking away all the pieces from the board. If all the pieces get traded off, white has a more pleasant position in this endgame. White is capable of creating something that black is not, and this is a passed pawn. We call a pawn a passed pawn when it can no longer be stopped by an enemy pawn, but only by the king. And the king is the most important piece in the pawn endgame, and creating a passed pawn makes the king the only piece that is able to defend it. This is truly the biggest disadvantage a doubled pawn can give. In this second example, we are going to take a look at what happens when black decides to play the move bishop to e6. I myself have seen this position a lot when playing the Vienna, and maybe some of you have been playing the 4 knights. You might think that taking the bishop is bad for black at first, because you double the pawns, but this doubled pawn actually has 3 important advantages as well. First is that the pawn on e6 is very important because it controls 2 very good outpost squares for the knights on b5 and f5. Normally as white you want to land your knights in these squares to create optimal pressure on the black king. Now that the pawn is on e6, it's no longer able to move to d5 and f5. The second advantage is that by playing f takes e7, there is now a semi-open f-file. The rook is now able to join the party and start putting pressure on the white f2 pawn. And doubling pawns always opens a file, so you need to be careful with these kinds of positions. The third benefit is that because the pawn controls d5, black is now able to take more control of the center by playing the move d5 itself. If white were to take black, it would resolve the double pawns and also take a big control of the center. So the lesson to take away from this is that it's important to evaluate all these advantages and disadvantages carefully. It's not always good to give up ambition to double pawns because it's not always as bad as it seems. One of the most awkward pawn structures you can have is a structure in which you have a pawn that is backwards. And I will show you a game I played in a classical tournament against a FIDE master in which I got a backwards pawn and slowly lost in a brutal way. It wasn't a game in the Stonewall Dutch, characterized by a setup I had not seen before but never played in an official match. A chess friend of mine always liked playing setups with knight h3 and bishop f4 against me, and I always knew to play bishop e7 back and not trade dark squared bishops, because if I put every pawn on light squares, you really need a dark squared bishop to put some pressure on the dark squares. But this FM out-prepared me with an early queen c2 and knight d2. And after I played knight e4, he took the knight on e4 and played f3 to try and weaken my pawn chain on the light squares. I took and created a big liability for myself. And for the rest of the game, my pieces got blocked by this awkward pawn on e6. If you end up being able to push this pawn forward, you can resolve most issues, but what my opponent did really well is block the ability for me to push the pawn forward and resolve the issue. Now, if an opponent ever gets a backwards pawn, be sure to take control over the square in front of it and really try to limit its ability to move forward. And after that, you can maneuver your pieces around and you have way more space than the opponent. The e5 square became a big outpost square to place his pieces, and at one point I got the opportunity to push forward and attack the knight, but I missed this and ended up being squeezed into a losing position. The big takeaway from this is that you should always avoid backwards pawns if you have no concrete options to push it forward immediately. Also, there's no real advantage to a backwards pawn because it only blocks your own space and it's very difficult to defend. For the fourth pawn structure, we're going to take a look at hanging pawns, and we can define hanging pawns as two pawns on adjacent files that have no pawns that are able to defend it. With the example you can see right here, I will try to explain the basics of how you want to play against this particular pawn structure. You can see that the C and D pawns for black are blocked by the white B and E pawns, together with the white pieces that really prevent them from moving forward. And when taking a look at this position, something you want to take advantage of is the immobility of the pawns. If you end up landing in an endgame where the pawn structure has remained the same, you can see that both of the pawns have become very weak because they can easily be attacked by the rooks on the open file, and also there's no way to move them forward. And the only way you could defend these pawns is with pieces, because the B and E pawns have disappeared, which makes it necessary to make concessions in your piece play for black. Because you have to defend the pawns with your pieces only, it prevents them from becoming as active as they would like to be. So the main thing to take away from positions like these is that you want to block them from moving up the board and start attacking them. Also, trading off too many pieces is in a disadvantageous way can lead to a worse and perhaps losing endgame. For the fifth and final principle of this video, we're going to take a look at queenside majority and minorities. And middle games where you have either a queenside majority or minority require you to understand something about these kinds of positions. Normally, if you end up getting a queenside majority, this means that you want to play on that side of the board mostly. Pawn play becomes very important when a lot of pieces leave the board, and if you have a majority on the queen side, this means you can start a majority attack. Queenside majority is stronger when both kings have castled to the king side. The reason for this is that when you can create a passed pawn on the queen side, it's hard to defend for the king if it's already on the king side. You can let your opening choice depend on if you like to play middle games with a pawn majority on the queen side. For example, I like playing the Alpine Sicilian, and this opening usually ends up giving you a 3-on-2 on the queen side. Now, you don't want to push your pawns too early because it weakens them, and with a lot of pieces on the board, it's easier to capitalize on that weakness. You want to trade off most of the pieces so that you can safely start pushing your pawns and try to create a passed pawn and win the game with it. When you have a pawn minority, usually you want to start a minority attack. And one of the best examples of a minority attack is seen in the Carlsbad structure. This is a structure where the white c-pawn is traded for the black e-pawn. And this could, for example, happen in a Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation, where you take with the pawn on c4 on d5, and black takes back with the e-pawn. For white, a plan would be to start lunging your b-pawn forward in order to create weaknesses in the black pawn structure on the queen side. And another strategy could be to play for f3 and an e4 pawn break. How to execute these attacks best is something I would be able to talk about for hours, but in this video I wanted to show you a lot of the basics so you have a good idea of what these concepts mean. That's going to be all for this video. I really hope you enjoyed the basic strategical ideas in the middle games with certain pawn structures. If you didn't understand everything immediately, feel free to watch pieces of the video again or ask questions in the comment section so that I can respond to them as soon as possible. Thanks a lot for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.